यस असल गोठालो अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय सेवाकाईको आयोजनाद्वारा सञ्चालित भिडियो बाइबल स्कुलको शैक्षिक तालिममा हामी तपाईलाई हार्दिक स्वागत गर्दछौं। साथै परमेश्वरले तपाईहरूलाई आशिष दिउन्। यो चाहिँ अगुवाको निर्माणको विषयमा सुरु गरिएको श्रेणीबद्ध अध्ययनको 5औं चरण हो। यस चरणमा दर्शन देख्नेहरूका निम्ति भन्ने विषयमा अध्ययन गर्नेछौं र हामीलाई सिकाउँदै हुनुहुन्छ रेभरेन्ड ब्रायन हस्टन।
I'd like you to turn with me in the scripture to the Gospel of John, chapter 9.
तपाई मसँग यूहन्नाको सुसमाचार 9 अध्याय पल्टाउनुहोस्।
We're going to be looking at the subject of vision.
हामी दर्शनको विषयमा हेर्नेछौं।
The word says without vision, people perish.
वचनले भन्दछ कि बिना दर्शन मानिसहरू मर्दछन्।
So much potential goes to waste because of a lack of vision.
बिना दर्शनको कारणले गर्दाखेरि धेरै सम्भावित कुराहरू पनि नष्ट हुँदछन्।
Others have
अनि
misguided
कति
vision.
व्यक्तिहरूले दर्शनलाई गल्ती तरिकाले प्रयोग गरेका छन्।
There are some whose vision is unrealistic.
कतिजना व्यक्तिको दर्शन अवास्तविक छ।
It's not a vision based on faith, it's a vision based on presumption.
कुनै दर्शन विश्वासमा आधारित छन् भने कुनै दर्शन अनुमानमा आधारित छन्।
It is the plan and the will of God for you to be a person whose life is filled with vision.
तपाईको जीवन दर्शन र योजनाले भरिपूर्ण होस् भन्ने परमेश्वरको इच्छा र योजना हो।
And vision can open tremendous opportunity for you to live a life filled with
अनि
destiny.
भविष्यको साथमा भएको जीवन जिउनलाई दर्शनले तपाईलाई सहायता गर्दछ।
But believe me, if you do have a vision, there are not everybody is going to be excited by
तपाई
that dream.
विश्वास गर्नुहोस् कि त्यो दर्शन त्यो सपनाबाट सबै व्यक्तिहरू एकदमै उत्तेजित भएका छैनन्।
As we look at John chapter 9, it tells the story of a blind man healed by Jesus.
यूहन्ना 9 अध्यायमा येशूले निको पार्नु भएको एकजना अन्धा व्यक्तिको बारेमा बताउँदछ।
In verse 1 of the chapter, it says, now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth.
एक पदले भन्दछ येशू त्यहाँबाट जाँदै गर्नु हुँदाखेरि जन्मैको अन्धालाई देख्नुभयो।
In verse 7, Jesus said to this man, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing.
7 पदमा येशूले यो व्यक्तिलाई भन्नुभयो सिलोआममा गएर तैँले पखाल अनि त्यसपछि त्यसले देख्यो।
Jesus brought sight to a blind man,
येशूले एउटा अन्धा व्यक्तिलाई दृष्टि दिनुभयो।
a man who formerly could not see.
यो मान्छेले पहिला देख्न सकेको थिएन।
When the Spirit of God comes alive in you, you can receive vision and begin to see in a way you've never seen before.
जब परमेश्वरको आत्मा तपाईमा आउनुहुन्छ तपाईले पहिला कहिल्यै नदेखेको दर्शन देख्न सक्नुहुनेछ।
There's many people in life who can see naturally, but spiritually they have no vision.
धेरै व्यक्तिहरूले स्वाभाविक रूपमा आफ्नो आँखाले त देख्छन् तर आत्मिक रूपमा उनीहरुसँग दर्शन छैन।
Helen Keller was the woman who invented the blind language, Braille.
हेलन केलर भन्ने स्त्रीले नै ब्रायल भन्ने यो अन्धाहरूले पढ्ने भाषाको प्रतिपादन गरिन्।
She was once asked if she could imagine anything worse than being blind.
अनि तपाईले उनको बारेमा विचार गर्नुहोस् उनी अन्धा थिइन्।
She said yes, having eyes but still not being able to see.
अनि उनले भन्छन् आँखा भएर पनि नदेख्नेहरू छन्।
In other words, having sight but not having
अनि
vision.
एउटा कुरामा भन्ने हो भने आँखा त छ तर दर्शन छैन।
Many people are just maintaining in their leadership and in their ministries.
धेरै मान्छेहरूले आफ्नो सेवाकाईमा यस्तो किसिमको कुरालाई जारी त राखेका छन् अगुवापनलाई।
They're just existing.
तिनीहरू त छन् त्यहाँ अस्तित्वमा छन्।
Jesus gave this man sight,
येशूले यो व्यक्तिलाई दृष्टि दिनुभयो।
but he was surrounded by people who could already see naturally, but they obviously had very little vision.
तर ऊ यस्तो व्यक्तिले घेरिएको थियो जसले देख्न त सक्थे तर दर्शन थिएन।
We're going to look from the scriptures at these groupings of people and look at the various opposition the blind man received.
अनि यो अन्धा मान्छेले सामना गर्न परेको सतावट र विरोधको बारेमा हामी हेर्ने छौं।
Verse 2 speaks about the disciples.
2 पदले चेलाहरूको बारेमा भन्दछ।
Verse 8 speaks about the neighbors.
अनि 8 पदले छिमेकीहरूको बारेमा भन्दछ।
In verse 13, it's the Pharisees.
अनि 13 पदले फारिसीको बारेमा भन्दछ।
In verse 18, it's the Jews.
अनि 18 पदले यहुदीको बारेमा भन्दछ।
And in verse 20, it's the parents.
अनि 20 पदले उसको बाउआमाको बारेमा भन्दछ।
And their lack of vision was evident as you look through the story.
अनि जब तपाई यो कथा हेर्दै जानुभयो भने उनीहरुमा जीवनमा कमी भएको कुरा दर्शनको कमी थियो।
The disciples in this story represented the spirit of
यो
analysis.
कथामा चेलाहरूले एउटा विश्लेषण गर्ने आत्माको प्रतिनिधित्व गर्दछन्।
Look with me at verse 2.
मसँग 2 पद पढ्नुहोस् त।
It says, as Jesus' disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?
उहाँका चेलाहरूले उहाँलाई सोधे, रब्बी कसले पाप गर्यो, यसले कि यसका बाबुआमाले यो अन्धो जन्मियो?
Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him.
यसुले भन्नुभयो, न त यसले पाप गर्यो न यसका आमा बाबुले, तर यस हेतुले कि परमेश्वरको काम यी मानिसको जीवनमा प्रकट होस्।
I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work.
मलाई पठाउनु हुनेका कामहरू हामीले दिन छँदै गर्नुपर्छ, रात आउँछ जब कसैले काम गर्न सक्दैन।
In verse 5, Jesus said, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world.
यसुले 5 पदमा भन्नुहुन्छ, जबसम्म म यस संसारमा छु, म संसारको ज्योति हुँ।
So the disciples were asking, why is this man blind?
अनि चेलाहरूले सोध्दै थिए, यो मान्छे किन अन्धो जन्मियो?
They said, was it his sin or his parents' sin?
उनीहरूले सोध्दै थिए, उसको पाप हो कि उसका आमा बुवाको पाप हो?
And Jesus' answer was very straight.
अनि येशूको जवाफ सिधा थियो।
He said in verse 3, look, it's not this man's sin nor his parents'
3
sin.
पदमा उहाँले भन्नुभयो, यो यसको पाप पनि होइन, यसका बुवा आमाको पाप पनि होइन।
He said, while it's still day, I need to be getting about healing.
अनि दिन छँदै नै मैले काम गर्न पर्दछ।
So many people are looking at reasons and questions and asking why.
धेरै मान्छेहरूले कारण खोज्दै छन् अनि किन भनेर प्रश्न गर्दै छन्।
The disciples focused on the problem.
अनि चेलाहरूले पनि समस्यामा केन्द्रित गराए आफ्नो ध्यान।
Jesus was committed to bringing the answer.
अनि येशूले जवाफ दिने कोसिस गर्दै हुनुहुन्थ्यो।
So much of the church is looking at the problem.
अनि धेरै मण्डलीले समस्यालाई हेर्दै छन्।
So much of the church is caught up in trying to analyze and reason.
अनि धेरै मण्डलीले कारणलाई विश्लेषण गर्न खोज्दै छन्।
People want to have mission summits and all sorts of retreats and all sorts of sessions to question and wonder why.
अनि मानिसहरूले सबै किसिमका प्रश्नहरू, सबै किसिमका कुराहरू, समस्याहरूको कुरा गर्दछन्।
They can be paralyzed by analysis.
अनि यो विश्लेषणबाट उनीहरू पक्षघाती हुन सक्दछन्।
Psychologists speak of a condition called catatonic
मनोवैज्ञानिकहरूले
schizophrenia.
क्याटाटोनिक सिजोफ्रेनिया भन्ने एउटा अवस्थाको बारेमा बताउँदछन् जुन डरबाट पक्षघात गराउँछन्।
Yeah. Catatonic schizophrenia is where someone may climb out of their bed and just stop still in one position.
अनि त्यो क्याटाटोनिक अवस्था भनेको कस्तो भने आफ्नो खाटबाट उठेपछि एउटै अवस्थामा पक्षघाती भए जस्तो भएर रहनु।
They may be like this,
अनि तिनीहरू यस्तो पनि हुन सक्छन्,
but they might be like that.
अनि यस्तो पनि हुन सक्छन्,
They might be like that.
अनि त्यस्तो पनि हुन सक्छन्।
But the reason they won't move is they're afraid they'll be punished.
यदि तिनीहरू डराए भने सजाय पाउनेछन्।
And it's a psychological
यो
condition.
एउटा मनोवैज्ञानिक शर्त हो।
Much of the church seems to be paralyzed by fear.
अनि डरबाट कति मण्डलीहरू पक्षघाती भएका छन्।
So the disciples thought this was a really good question.
अनि चेलाहरूले सोचे होला नि यो एकदमै राम्रो प्रश्न हो।
They thought it was a very theological
उनीहरूले
question.
विचार गरे कि यो एउटा ईश्वर शास्त्रीय प्रश्न हो।
Why is this man blind? Whose sin?
अनि यो मान्छे कसरी अन्धा भयो, कसले पाप गर्यो?
But Jesus wasn't looking at why, he was committed to the answer.
अनि किन भन्ने जवाफमा येशू समर्पित हुनुहुन्थेन।
We can get so locked into reasoning and questioning that we forget to just get out and do what God's called
अनि
us to do.
परमेश्वरले हामीलाई गर्न बोलाउनु भएको कुरामा हामी नगरेर कति प्रश्नको कारणले हामी बाँधिएर बस्न सक्छौँ।
So many people put their faith in having titles or degrees or letters.
कति मानिसहरूले आफ्नो उपाधि मैले यति पढेको छु, ती पढेको छु भन्ने कुरामा ध्यान दिन्छन्।
And whilst knowledge is power,
अनि उनीहरूको ज्ञानलाई नै शक्ति सम्झन्छन्।
the day comes when you have to get out to school and start doing what you're called to do.
अनि त्यो दिन आउनेछ तपाईँ आफ्नो स्कुलबाट निस्किएर तपाईँलाई गर्न बोलाइएको काम तपाईँले गर्नुपर्छ।
Jesus began both to do and to teach, the Bible says.
अनि बाइबलले भन्दछ यसुले गर्न पनि सिकाउनु भयो अनि त्यहाँबाट गर्नु पनि भयो।
I know a man who has many times attempted to start businesses.
अनि मलाई म एउटा मान्छेलाई चिन्दछु जो एउटा काम गर्न धेरै पटक रोकेको थियो।
And every time he starts, he will print his business cards.
अनि जति पटक उसले आफ्नो काम सुरु गर्छ एउटा कार्ड छाप्छ, भिजिटिङ कार्ड।
He will register the company.
अनि उसले आफ्नो कम्पनीलाई दर्ता गर्छ।
He will do all sorts of other things in an attempt to begin business.
अनि आफ्नो काम सुरु गर्नलाई उसले सबै किसिमका कुराहरू मिलाउँछ
He does everything except actually start trading.
अनि उसले वास्तवमा त्यो व्यापारको काम सुरु गर्नु भन्दा पनि अरु सबै कुरा गर्छ
And the reason he never starts trading is fear.
अनि व्यापार उसले सुरु नगर्ने कारण किनभने डरले गर्दा
And in the church, you can see the same things happening.
अनि मण्डलीमा पनि यस्तै कुरा घटेको तपाई देख्नुहुन्छ
Leaders will do the paperwork.
अनि अगुवाहरूले पेपरमा यति गर्ने भनेर योजना बनाउँछन्
They'll write the letters.
अनि लेख्छन् त्यहाँ
They'll go back and do more
अनि
training.
तिनीहरू अझै तालिममा पनि जान्छन् त्यो गर्नलाई
They'll keep reading books.
किताब पढिरहन्छन्
They'll listen to
तिनीहरूले
tapes.
भिडियोहरू हेर्छन् टेपहरू सुन्छन्
But the Bible says that you need to start doing
तर
it.
बाइबलले भन्दछ तपाईले गर्न सुरु गर्न पर्दछ
Don't be paralyzed by fear.
तिनीहरू डरले पक्षघाती हुन सक्छन्
You have to step out
तपाईले पाइला अगाडि बढाउनुस्
and start doing the things that God has called you to do.
परमेश्वरले तपाईलाई गर्न बोलाउनु भएको काम गर्न सुरु गर्नुहोस्
People ask so many questions.
मानिसहरूले धेरै प्रश्न सोध्छन्
Recently, I flew into Phoenix, Arizona.
अनि हालसालै म फिल एरिजोनिया भन्ने ठाउँमा उडे
I'd been flying about 20 hours from Sydney, Australia to Phoenix.
अनि फिनिक्स भन्ने ठाउँमा सिडनी अस्ट्रेलियाबाट 20 घण्टामा उडे जहाजमा
And when I arrived, I was met at the airport by a couple of very nice men.
अनि जब म एयरपोर्टमा पुगे त्यहाँ एउटा जोडी एकदमै असल जोडीको साथमा पुगे
But because I'm a pastor, when they met me, they got very spiritual.
अनि जब म पास्टर भएको कुरा उनीहरूले थाहा पाए हामी भेटघाट गरे उनीहरू पनि आत्मिक भए
I just needed to sleep.
अनि म त्यहाँ सुत्न पर्थ्यो
And they began to ask me, what's the Lord saying? What do you feel the Lord's saying to the church today?
अनि तिनीहरूले सोधे तपाईले के अनुभव गर्नुभएको छ मण्डलीले प्रभुले मण्डलीलाई के भन्दै हुनुहुन्छ
And I just smiled and looked spiritual.
अनि म एकदमै आत्मिक देखिए
But in truth, I believe God's saying to the church today what He's been saying
अनि
for
मैले
2,000
भने कि
years.
आत्मामा भने कि परमेश्वरले आज मण्डलीलाई जे भन्नुभएको छ त्यो 2000 वर्ष अगाडि भन्नुभयो
It's all in the Great Commission.
हामीले महानाज्ञाको काम पूरा गर्नु पर्दछ
We're told to go therefore and make disciples,
हामी चेलाहरू बनाउन त्यहाँ जानु पर्दछ
baptize them and teach them,
तिनीहरूलाई बप्तिस्मा दिन सिकाउन
train them and release them,
तिनीहरूलाई तालिम दिन र छुटकारा दिन
build them up in the ways of God and send them out
अनि परमेश्वरको तरिकाले तिनीहरूलाई निर्माण गरेर तिनीहरूलाई पठाउन
so that they can go forth and make disciples.
ताकि तिनीहरू गएर पनि चेला बनाउन सकुन्
Baptize them and teach them
तिनीहरूलाई बप्तिस्मा दिएर सिकाउन
so that they can go forth and make disciples.
ताकि तिनीहरू गएर फेरि चेला बनाउन सकुन्
Baptize and teach them
तिनीहरूलाई बप्तिस्मा दिएर सिकाउने
so that they can go forth and make disciples.
फेरि तिनीहरू गएर त्यही गर्न सकुन्
But we get so caught up studying and wondering and
अनि हामी
questioning.
तर प्रश्न गर्ने अध्ययन गर्ने गर्दै गर्दा एकदमै थाकिसकेका छौँ दङ्ग परिसकेका
And the day comes when we have to start doing.
तर हामीले त्यो काम गर्न सुरु गर्नुपर्छ
The disciples said, whose sin was it that caused him to be blind?
अनि चेलाहरूले सोधे कसको पापले गर्दा यो अन्धा जन्मियो
People today want to look into things like the sins of the third and the fourth generation.
अनि आज मानिसहरूले तेस्रो चौथो पुस्ताको पापहरू हेर्ने प्रयास गर्दछन्
They want more counseling.
उनीहरूले अझै सरसल्लाह खोज्दछन्
They receive so much counseling that the counselor needs counseling.
अनि तिनीहरूले यति परामर्श पाइसके कि परामर्श दिनेलाई पनि परामर्श चाहिन्छ
They want healing of the memories,
तिनीहरूको स्मरण शक्तिमा चङ्गाई चाहिएको छ
inner healing,
भित्री चङ्गाई चाहिएको छ
healing from the scars of the memories of their ingrown toenail. There's always something to look at that will keep us where we are.
अनि सधैँ हामीले त्यस्तो कुरामा हेर्यौँ भने हामी जहाँ छौँ त्यही हामीलाई राख्दछ
But the word says, whom the Son of God sets free is free indeed.
वचनले भन्दछ जसलाई परमेश्वरको पुत्रले स्वतन्त्र गराउनुहुन्छ त्यो वास्तवमा स्वतन्त्र हुँदछ
So the day comes when you have to rise up in the freedom that Christ has given you and start to do the thing He's called you to do.
एक दिन आउनेछ तपाईँ येशू ख्रीष्टको नाममा उठेर अनि परमेश्वरले गर्न भन्नुभएको कुरा तपाईले गर्नुपर्नेछ
Don't get caught in the spirit of analysis.
विश्लेषणको आत्मामा नअल्झिनुहोस्
And don't be always focusing on the problem.
सधैँ आफ्नो समस्यामा ध्यान केन्द्रित नगर्नुहोस्
If we follow the example of Jesus, we're committed to the answers.
यदि हामीले येशूको आत्मा अनुसार जवाफ पाउनेछौँ
The second group of people in the story were the neighbors.
अनि यो कथामा भएको दोस्रो समूहका मानिसहरू छिमेकीहरू थिए
The neighbors represent a spirit of familiarity.
अनि छिमेकीले चिर परिचित आत्माको प्रतिनिधित्व गर्दछन्
Let's look at the story in verse 8.
हामी 8 पदबाट कथा पढ्ने छौं.
It says, therefore the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, is not this he who sat and begged?
त्यसका छिमेकीहरू र त्यसलाई भिख मागेको देख्नेहरूले भने बसेर भिख माग्ने मान्छे के यो हैन?
Some said, this is he. Others said, he's like him. He said, I am he.
कसैले भने हो त्यो त्यही हो, अरूले भने होइन त्यो त्यही जस्तो देखिन्छ, त्यसले भन्यो म त्यही हुँ.
Those who knew him previously had known him blind.
अनि जसले त्यसलाई पहिला देखेका थिए यो अन्धा थियो भन्ने कुरो थाहा थियो.
And now that this man could see, they were having problems
अहिले
recognizing
यो
him.
मान्छेले देख्न थालेपछि उनीहरुसँग समस्या भयो, उलाई चिन्दा.
Their problem was that they had known him previously.
किनभने उसलाई पहिल्यै जानेको कारणले समस्या खडा भयो.
They were familiar with what he was.
उ कस्तो थियो भन्ने कुरामा उनीहरु चिर परिचित थिए.
But if you're going to be ruled by the attitudes of people who have known what you were, you'll never be what God's called you to be.
अनि तपाई मानिसहरुबाट जहाँ मानिसहरुले जे भन्छन् त्यो अनुसार शासित हुनुभयो भने परमेश्वरले गर्न बोलाउनु भनेको काम तपाईले गर्नु सक्नु हुने छैन.
It's the will of God for you to be unrecognizable to those who knew you previously.
तपाईलाई पहिले चिन्नेहरुलाई नचिन्नु नै यो परमेश्वरको इच्छा हो.
After the resurrection, those who knew Jesus previously never recognized him.
अनि येशूलाई पहिले चिन्नेहरुले पनि येशूको पुनरुत्थानपछि उहाँलाई चिन्न सकेनन्.
The neighbors represent those people who know you well.
अनि छिमेकीहरुले तपाईले जसलाई राम्रोसित चिन्नुहुन्छ भन्ने कुराको प्रतिनिधित्व गर्दछन्.
They know your weaknesses and they know your past mistakes.
तिनीहरुले तपाईको बितेका जीवनमा भएका गल्ती र कमजोरीहरु थाहा पाउँदछन्.
They know you too well to believe that God could ever use you.
अनि परमेश्वरले तपाईलाई प्रयोग गर्न सक्नुहुन्छ भन्ने कुरा पनि उनीहरुलाई सक्नुहुन्छ कि सक्नुहुन्न भन्ने थाहा छ.
But we can't be ruled by their thinking.
तर तिनीहरुको विचारबाट हामी शासित हुनुहुन्न.
Because they don't see you the way that God sees you.
अनि तिनीहरुले देखे अनुसारले परमेश्वरले तपाईलाई हेर्नुहुन्न.
He sees your life filled with potential.
तपाईको जीवन सम्भाव्यताहरुले भरिएको परमेश्वर चाहनुहुन्छ.
He sees you through the eye of the Spirit.
उहाँले तपाईलाई आत्माको आँखाले हेर्नुहुन्छ.
And we can get locked into those who are too familiar with who we have been.
हामी कस्तो थियौ भन्ने कुरा परिचित भएकाहरुको बीचमा हामी साँचो लगाएर बस्न सक्दैनौं.
And then never rise up to be who God's called us to
अनि
be.
हामी त्यसरी बस्यौं भने परमेश्वरले हामीलाई जे गर्न बोलाउनु भएको छ त्यो गर्न सक्दैनौं.
Don't let others set your level in life.
त्यसैकारण तपाईको जीवनको स्तरलाई अरूले मिलाउन नदिनुहोस्.
I grew up the son of a pastor.
म पास्टरको छोराको रूपमा हुर्किएको हुँ.
And many people who knew me then would never ever believe what I'm doing now.
अहिले म के गर्दै छु भनेर मलाई पहिला चिन्नेहरुले अहिले विश्वास गर्दैनन्.
My father ran a Bible college.
अनि मेरो बुवाले एउटा बाइबल स्कुल चलाउनुहुन्थ्यो.
And one of the students had a little motorbike.
अनि एउटा विद्यार्थीको सानो मोटरसाइकल थियो.
When I was a schoolboy, my friends and I used to just take turns at riding the motorbike up and down the churchyard.
अनि हामी त्यहाँ स्कुलमा हुँदाखेरि मण्डलीको वरिपरि त्यो मोटरसाइकल चलाउने गर्थ्यौं.
And when we got a little bit more courage, we'd just take it up and down the street a little bit.
अनि हामीले अलिअलि उत्साह पाउँदै गएपछि बाटोमा पनि चलाउन थाल्यौं.
Then we started riding it round the block.
अनि त्यसपछि हामी फेरि गल्ली भित्र पनि चलाउन लाग्यौं.
Then we started riding it over the bridge and down the main street of the city.
अनि त्यसपछि हामी पुलमा चलाएर अनि त्यहाँबाट झर्दै फेरि मुख्य बाटोमा पनि चलाउन लाग्यौं.
And it all went well till one day I was riding the motorbike and met a
अनि
policeman.
जब एक दिन म र मेरो साथीले मोटरसाइकल चलाउँदै गर्दाखेरि पुलिसले हामीलाई भेट्यो.
And when I saw him, I panicked.
अनि म एकदमै डराएँ, विचलित भएँ.
I forgot where the brakes were.
अनि ब्रेक कहाँ छ भनेर मैले थाहा पाइनँ.
So I tried to stop it with my feet.
अनि मैले मेरो खुट्टाले रोक्न थालेँ.
And that was a good sign to the policeman that I didn't know what I was
अनि मैले
doing.
के गर्दै थिएँ भन्ने कुरा पुलिसले राम्रोसित चिन्यो. म कतिको जानेको छु भनेर.
So as I looked at him, he was going like this.
अनि मैले उसलाई हेरेँ, उ यसरी जाँदै थियो.
I was so afraid when I saw him that I got off the motorbike and forgot to put it on its stand.
अनि मैले पुलिसलाई देखेँ एकदम डराएर मोटरसाइकलबाट झरेँ तर त्यसको स्ट्यान्ड लाउन बिर्सेँ.
And it fell on the ground.
अनि मोटरसाइकल जमिनमा ढल्यो.
He said, "Can I see your license?"
पुलिसले भने म तिम्रो लाइसेन्स हेर्न सक्छु?
I said, "No."
अनि मैले भने छैन.
He said, "Have you got a license?"
अनि उनले भने तिमीसँग लाइसेन्स छ?
No.
छैन.
How old are you? He said.
तिमी कति उमेरको छौ?
13.
अनि 13 वर्ष.
Does the person who owns the motorbike know that you have it?
अनि तपाईले यो लिएर आएको मोटरसाइकलको धनीलाई थाहा छ तपाईले ल्याएको भन्ने कुरा?
No.
छैन.
And this was right outside the gate of my father's Bible college.
अनि यो मेरो बुवाको बाइबल स्कुलको ठ्याक्कै गेटको अगाडिपट्टि घटना हो.
And right at that time, all the students came out from their lectures.
अनि त्यही समयमा सबै विद्यार्थीहरू आफ्नो कक्षाबाट बाहिर आउँदै थिए
And I can still see them all standing there like this.
अनि तिनीहरू यसरी उभिएको मैले त्यहाँ देख्छु
It's the pastor's son again.
अनि यो पास्टरको छोरा
If I was ruled by those who knew me previously,
यदि मलाई पहिल्यै चिनेकाहरूले शासन गरेको भए
I wouldn't stand up and be who God's called me to be
अनि
today.
आज म यहाँ उभिएर परमेश्वरले मलाई बोलाउनु भएको व्यक्तिको रूपमा म हुन सक्थिनँ
So often, even in the church, we can have people around us who have been familiar with us.
अनि धेरै पटक मण्डलीमा पनि हामीसँग चिर परिचित मान्छेहरू हुन्छन्
Jesus talked about a prophet being without honor in his home country.
अनि येशूले आफ्नै देशमा अनादर गरिएको अगमवक्ताको बारेमा भन्नुभएको छ
People know you too
अनि
well.
मानिसहरूले पनि तपाईलाई राम्रोसँग चिन्दछन्
They know all about you.
अनि तपाईको बारेमा उनीहरूलाई थाहा छ
One of the great keys in ministry is not locking people into what they once were.
अनि तिनीहरू एकपटक कहाँ थिए भन्ने कुरालाई बन्द गरेर नराख्नु नै एउटा सेवाकाईको मुख्य कुरा हो
Not being ruled by mistakes they once made.
अनि तिनीहरूले एकपटक गरेको त्यो गल्तीबाट बन्धनमा बाँधिनु होइन
If you're going to be releasing leaders, you have to give them room to develop and grow.
यदि तपाईले अगुवाहरू निर्माण गर्ने हो भने तिनीहरूलाई बढ्ने ठाउँ तपाईले दिनु पर्दछ
You have to give them room to change.
तिनीहरूलाई परिवर्तन हुने मौका तपाईले दिनु पर्दछ
Thank God Jesus doesn't judge us according to what we once
परमेश्वरलाई
were.
धन्यवाद दिनुस् हामी एकपटक जस्तो थियौं त्यो आधारमा प्रभुले हामीलाई न्याय गर्नुहुन्न
He gives us room to move into who He has called us to be.
अनि उहाँले हामीलाई जे हुन बोलाउनु भएको छ त्यसरी अगाडि बढ्नुस्
Don't let others set the level for your life and ministry.
तपाईको जीवन र सेवाकाईको लागि अरूले स्तर बनाउन नदिनुस्
Let God set the level.
परमेश्वरले नै स्तर बनाउनुहोस्
Because people can't see what God puts in your spirit.
परमेश्वरले तपाईको आत्मामा हालेको कुरा मानिसहरूले देख्न सक्दैनन्
A few years ago, we started a ministry, a resource ministry in our church called Power Ministries
अनि हाम्रो
International.
मण्डलीमा केही वर्ष अगाडि हामीले सोर्स मिनिस्ट्री भनेर अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय सेवाकाईको रूपमा सुरु गर्यौं
And it was to release the worship and the praise and the teaching from our church in Australia.
अस्ट्रेलियामा भएको हाम्रो मण्डलीबाट शिक्षा दिने स्तुति प्रशंसा आराधना गर्ने कुरामा मानिसहरूलाई अगाडि बढाउने
When we named it Power Ministries International, some people laughed at the word international.
जब हामीले यो सेवाकाईलाई अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय सेवाकाईको रूपमा नाम दियौं कति मानिसहरू हाँसे
And if you looked at it naturally, I can understand.
यदि तपाईं स्वाभाविक रूपमा हेर्नुभयो भने म बुझ्न सक्छु यो कुरा
Because the whole ministry was in a store cupboard. But by the grace of God,
तर परम प्रभुको अनुग्रहले
the praise and worship of Hillsongs Australia now is going around the world.
स्तुति प्रशंसाको यो कार्यक्रम आज संसारभरि पुगेको छ
And is being distributed in almost every continent of the world.
संसारको प्राय जसो सबै महादेशमा यो बाँडिएको छ
And not a day goes by without requests for the teaching and the preaching.
अनि दिनदिनै यो शिक्षा दिने अनुरोधहरू आइरहेका छन्
From countries all over the world.
संसारभरि भएका देशहरूबाट
It would have been so easy to drop that word international.
यो अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय भन्ने शब्दलाई निकाल्न एकदमै सजिलो थियो
To be ruled by the attitude of the neighbors.
छिमेकीहरूको एउटा चरित्रको कारणले उनीहरूको रिसले गर्दा
To be ruled by the attitudes of those who knew me too well.
अनि मलाई राम्रोसँग चिनेका व्यक्तिहरूको व्यवहारले गर्दा
But they couldn't see what God can see.
तर परमेश्वरले देख्न सक्ने कुरा उनीहरूले देख्न सकेनन्
They can't see what God had put in my spirit.
परमेश्वरले मेरो आत्मामा हाल्नु भएको कुरा तिनीहरूले देख्न सकेनन्
So it's an enemy of vision to be ruled by those who are too familiar.
हामीसँग परिचित भएकाहरू नै दर्शनका शत्रुहरू हुन्
The disciples represented the spirit of analysis.
चेलाहरूले विश्लेषणको आत्माको प्रतिनिधित्व गर्दछन्
The neighbors represented a spirit of familiarity.
छिमेकीले चिनजानको आत्माको पहिचान गर्छ
The next group were the Pharisees, who represented a spirit of religion.
अनि अर्को समूह थिए फारिसीहरू जसले धर्मको प्रतिनिधित्व गर्दछन्
The neighbors, as you look at verse 8, those who had previously seen that he was blind, said, "Is this not he who sat and begged?"
जसले देखेका थिए उसलाई पहिले नै उसले भन्थे मागेर बस्ने यही होइन र
Some said, "This is he." Others said, "He's like him." He said, "I
कतिले
am he."
भन्दथे यो त्यही हो कतिले भन्थे त्यो जस्तै हो तर उसले भन्छ म त्यही व्यक्ति हुँ
He said, "I am he."
उसले भन्छ म त्यही हुँ
He's me.
म हुँ
I remember you.
म तिमीलाई सम्झन्छु
I never realized you
तिमी
looked
त्यस्तो
like that.
देखिन्छौ भनेर म कहिले पनि महसुस गरिनँ।
Because now, by the grace of God, he could see.
तर परमेश्वरको अनुग्रहले गर्दा उले देख्न सक्ने भएको छ।
In verse 10, therefore they said to him, how were your eyes opened? And he answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and I received sight.
10 पदमा तिनीहरूले भने तेरो आँखा कसले खोलिदिए त? त्यसले जवाफ दियो, येशू भन्ने एउटा मानिसले माटोको लेप बनाएर मेरो आँखामा लगाइदिएर मलाई भन्नुभयो, सिलोआममा जाऊ र पखाल। तब गएर मैले पखाले र म देख्ने भएँ।
Then they said to him, where is he? He said, I don't
तिनीहरूले
know.
त्यसलाई भने तिनी कहाँ छन्? त्यसले भन्यो म जान्दिनँ,
I was blind.
म अन्धा थिएँ।
Oh, when you've got vision, when you begin to see, not everybody understands.
जब तपाईले दर्शन देखेर अनि देख्न थाल्नुहुन्छ त्यो कुरा सबैले बुझ्दैनन्।
And in verse 13, they brought him who was formerly blind to the Pharisees.
13 पदमा अघि अन्ध हुने त्यस मान्छेलाई तिनीहरूले फारिसीहरू कहाँ ल्याए।
Thank God when we find Jesus, we're all formerly something.
अनि परमेश्वरलाई धन्यवाद दिनुहोस् कि प्रभु येशू ख्रीष्टले पहिला हामी कहाँ थियौं त्यहाँबाट हामीलाई भेट्टाउनुहुन्छ।
This man was formerly blind,
यो मान्छे पहिला अन्धा थियो,
but now he could see.
अहिले उले देख्न सक्ने भएको
It's
छ।
a wonderful thing when you're serving God, when you begin to see
जब तपाईँ
God-given
परमेश्वरको सेवा
possibilities.
गर्न थाल्नुहुन्छ तब परमेश्वरले दिनुभएका सम्भाव्यतालाई प्राप्त गर्नुहुन्छ।
God opened your eyes to God-given opportunity.
परमेश्वरले तपाईको आँखा खोल्नुहुन्छ र अवसर दिनुहुन्छ।
But the Pharisees were also full of doubt.
तर फारिसीहरू पनि एकदमै शङ्काले भरिएका छन्।
They had a spirit that was an enemy to vision.
अनि तिनीहरूको आत्मा दर्शनको शत्रु भएको थियो।
As you look at verse 15, it says, then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put clay on my eyes and I washed and I see.
15 पद हेर्नुहोस्, त्यसपछि हामी थाहा पाउँछौँ फारिसीहरूले त्यसलाई सोधे त कसरी देख्ने भइस्? त्यसले तिनीहरूलाई भन्यो, उहाँले मेरो आँखामा माटोको लेप लगाइदिनु भयो अनि मैले पखालेर देख्ने भएँ।
Therefore, some of the Pharisees said, this man's not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them.
फारिसीहरू मध्ये कुनैले भने त्यो मानिस परमेश्वरबाट आएको होइन किनकि त्यसले सब्बात दिन पालन गर्दैन। तर अरूले भने कसरी पापी मानिसले यस्ता चिन्हहरू गर्न सक्दछ र तिनीहरूका बीचमा फाटो हुन गयो।
The Pharisee spirit is a religious spirit.
फारिसीहरूको आत्मा धार्मिक आत्मा हो, धर्मको आत्मा हो।
It's a spirit that also questions and doubts
अनि
vision.
यो त्यस्तो आत्मा हो जसले दर्शनलाई प्रश्न गर्छ र शङ्का गर्छ।
Every crowd has some Pharisees.
हरेक भिडमा कोही न कोही फारिसीहरू छन्।
And if you're going to be a visionary, you cannot be ruled by their attitude.
यदि तपाईँ दर्शन देख्ने व्यक्ति हुनुहुन्छ भने तिनीहरूको व्यवहारले तपाईँ रोकिन सक्नुहुन्न।
These Pharisees said in verse 16, this man can't be from God.
अनि यो फारिसीहरूले भन्दछन् कि यो मान्छे परमेश्वरबाट आएको होइन।
The Pharisee spirit always sounds like that.
अनि सधैँ फारिसीहरूले यस्तै कुरा गर्छन्,
This can't be of God.
यो परमेश्वर हुन सक्छ।
How could this be of God?
कसरी यो परमेश्वर हुन सक्छ?
All the Pharisee can see is what is not of God.
अनि फारिसीले देख्न सक्ने कुरा परमेश्वरको के होइन,
They never see what is of God.
परमेश्वरको के हो भन्ने कुरा उनीहरू कहिले देख्दैनन्।
So many people are ruled by a religious attitude.
धेरै मानिसहरू धार्मिक क्रियाकलापबाट शासन गरिएका छन्
They're bound with blinkered
अनि
thinking.
तिनीहरू एकदमै नराम्रो व्यवहार सोचाइमा छन्
They can't see what God would have them see.
अनि परमेश्वरले तिनीहरूलाई के भनेको कुरा सुन्दैनन्
So they're always trying to bring things downwards.
अनि तिनीहरूले सबै कुरालाई तल झार्ने कोसिस गर्छन्।
You can't be ruled by that spirit if you're going to be a visionary.
यदि तपाईँ दर्शन देख्ने हो भने त्यस्तो किसिमको आत्माबाट तपाईँ शासन गरिनु हुने छैन।
All that these Pharisees could see was that Jesus was healing on the Sabbath.
अनि यो फारिसीले देख्न सकेको कुरा सब्बातको दिनमा येशूले चंगाइदिनुहुन्थ्यो।
Jesus often healed people on the Sabbath.
अनि येशूले प्राय जसो सब्बातको दिनमा मानिसलाई निको पार्नुभयो।
And I don't believe it was a
म
coincidence.
विश्वास गर्दिन कि यो अचानक भएको कुरा हो।
I think Jesus knew exactly what he was doing.
येशूले के गर्दै हुनुहुन्थ्यो भन्ने कुरा उहाँलाई थाहा थियो राम्रोसँग।
When he confounded the religious spirits by healing on the Sabbath.
सब्बातको दिन उहाँले चंगाई दिएर धार्मिक मानिसका विचारलाई अल्मल्याउनुहुन्थ्यो।
So often God doesn't do things the way that we expect.
हामीले आशा गरेको अनुसार कतिपटक परमेश्वरले काम गर्नुहुन्न।
How often would you expect God to heal somebody by spitting and making clay?
अनि परमेश्वरले माटोमा थुकेर हिलो बनाएर अनि कसैलाई निको पार्ने कुरा तपाईले विचार गर्न सक्नुहुन्छ?
He doesn't fit into our way of thinking.
अनि त्यस्तो किसिमको विचारमा कसैले पनि सोच्दैन।
And when God gives you a vision, it won't fit into everybody's thinking.
अनि जब परमेश्वरले तपाईलाई दर्शन दिनुहुन्छ के सबै मानिसहरूले विचार गर्छन् त?
But the Bible tells us in the book of Colossians not to be ruled by those sorts of attitudes.
बाइबलले भन्दछ कलस्सीको पुस्तकमा त्यस्ता किसिमका व्यवहारहरूबाट हामी शासन गरिनुहुन्न।
It's interesting as you look at these verses, verse 16, that there was a division even amongst the Pharisees.
अनि तपाईले यहाँ 16 पदमा हेर्नुहोस् त फारिसीहरूको बीचमा त्यहाँ विभाजन भयो।
And if you allow that Pharisee spirit to rule, it will always be divisive.
यदि तपाईले त्यो फारिसीको आत्माले तपाईलाई शासन गर्न दिनुभयो भने यसले विभाजन ल्याउँछ, फाटो ल्याउँछ।
The kind of spirit that can be so ruled by religion that it misses out on the power of a miracle.
अनि त्यो धार्मिक आत्मा जसले मानिसलाई शासन गर्न खोज्छ त्यसले आश्चर्य कर्मको आत्मालाई पनि गुमाउँदछ।
Oh, thank God he doesn't move the way that we expect.
अनि परमेश्वरलाई धन्यवाद दिनुहोस् हामीले आशा गरेको अनुसार उहाँ चल्नुहुन्न।
You know, just an interesting thing
अनि
here.
यहाँ एउटा महत्त्वपूर्ण चाखलाग्दो कुरा छ।
Of course, this man had been blind.
यो मान्छे अन्धो थियो।
So when Jesus healed him, he spat to make clay.
अनि येशूले थुकेर हिलो बनाएर उसको आँखाबाट निको पार्नुभयो।
And he rubbed the clay into his eyes.
अनि उहाँले त्यो हिलो उसको आँखामा लगाइदिनु भयो।
But every time the man recounted the story, he never mentioned that Jesus spat.
अनि जहिले जहिले यो मान्छेले त्यो कथा बताउँदा घटना बताउँदाखेरि कहिले पनि त्यो हिलो आँखामा लगाइदिएको कुरा गर्थेन।
In these verses, he just said that Jesus
यी
made
पदहरूमा
clay.
येशूले हिलो बनाउनु भयो भनेर उसले भनेको छ।
Maybe he never knew how Jesus made clay.
अनि कसरी येशूले हिलो बनाउनु भयो भनेर भनेको छैन।
Perhaps he wouldn't be so excited about telling the story if he knew just how Jesus had made the clay.
अनि येशूले हिलो बनाउनु भयो भनेर उत्तेजित भएर उसले भनेको छ तर कसरी बनाउनु भयो भनेको छैन।
Thank God that in advance we don't always know how Jesus is going to fulfill his purpose in our life.
परमेश्वरलाई धन्यवाद दिनुहोस् कसरी येशूले आफ्नो उद्देश्य हाम्रो जीवनमा पूरा गर्नुहुन्छ हामीलाई थाहा छैन।
If we knew how it was going to happen, we wouldn't always be so excited about it in advance.
यदि यो कसरी हुन्छ भनेर हामीले थाहा पायौँ भने हामी एकदमै उत्तेजित हुनेछौँ।
But it's that element of surprise that gives life its adventure.
तर त्यो एउटा आश्चर्यपूर्ण तरिकाले हामीलाई जीवन दिदछ।
And we must not get ruled by that religious spirit.
त्यसै कारण त्यो धार्मिक आत्माबाट हामी शासन गरिएको हुनु हुँदैन।
It just sees what day of the week it is,
यिनीहरूले यसले यो देख्दछ कि आज हप्ताको कुन दिन हो भनेर,
or what you look like,
तपाई कस्तो देखिनुहुन्छ भनेर,
or the way you speak,
तपाई बोल्ने आधारमा,
whether or not you use exactly the right words.
तपाईले ठीक शब्द प्रयोग गर्नुहुन्छ कि गर्नुहुन्न।
But thank God the Son of God has set us free.
तर परमेश्वरलाई धन्यवाद दिनुहोस् परमेश्वरका पुत्रले हामीलाई स्वतन्त्र बनाउनुहुन्छ।
And we can rise up above that religious spirit
हामी त्यो आत्मिक धार्मिक आत्मा भन्दा पनि माथि उठ्न सक्छौं
and live according to the Spirit of God.
अनि परमेश्वरको आत्मा अनुसार जिउन सक्दछौं।
Then we allow God's word to be our source.
त्यसपछि परमेश्वरको आत्मालाई हामीले हाम्रो जीवनको स्रोत बनाउने छौं।
What a wonderful opportunity that is.
कस्तो अचम्मको अवसर हाम्रो लागि त्यो।
So many people are ruled by outward things.
अनि धेरै मानिसहरू बाहिरी कुराबाट शासन गरिएकाहरू छन्।
Many times in our church I've seen people come to find Jesus Christ, men with earrings in their ear.
धेरै मान्छेहरू हाम्रो मण्डलीमा येशूलाई खोज्न कानमा मुन्द्री र गहनाहरू लगाएर आएको मैले देखेको छु।
And in our culture, some Christian people find that
अनि
offensive.
हाम्रो संस्कृतिमा कति ईसाईहरूले त्यसलाई आफूले बचाउने कुरा सम्झन्छन् आफ्नो बचावट।
But they could get so ruled by the earring in the ear, they lose the
अनि
miracle of the
तिनीहरू
salvation.
त्यो मुन्द्री र गरगहनाहरूले शासन गरिएको कारणले गर्दाखेरि परमेश्वरको आश्चर्यतर्म गुमाउँछन्।
Thank God that Jesus doesn't rule by outward
परमेश्वरलाई
things,
धन्यवाद दिनुहोस् येशू ख्रीष्ट बाहिरी कुराहरूबाट शासन गरिएको हुनुहुन्न।
but He has the power to change a heart.
तर हाम्रो हृदय परिवर्तन गर्ने शक्ति उहाँसँग छ।
And if you're going to be a visionary, you can't be ruled by religious thinking.
यदि तपाईँ एउटा दर्शन देख्ने व्यक्ति हुने हो भने यस्तो किसिमको धार्मिक विचारबाट बाँधिनुहुन्न।
Because religious thinking always judges by natural
अनि यो
sight.
धार्मिक कुराले जहिले पनि प्राकृतिक दृष्टिबाट न्याय गर्दछ।
And God wants to open your eyes to spiritual issues
तपाईले आफ्नो आत्मिक आँखाहरू खोल्नु पर्दछ
so that you're enlarged to fulfill His purpose.
ताकि तपाईँ उहाँको उद्देश्य पूरा गर्नलाई फैलन सक्नुहुनेछ।
The fourth group of people were the Jews.
अनि चौथो किसिमका मानिसहरू यहुदीहरू थिए।
Now the Jews represented a spirit of unbelief.
यहुदीहरूले अविश्वासीको आत्माको प्रतिनिधित्व गर्दछन्।
They're spoken about in verses 17, 18, and 19.
यो 18, 19, 17, 18, 19 पदमा भनिएको छ।
In verse 17, the Pharisees said to the blind man again, "What do you say about Jesus? Because he opened your eyes." And he said, "Well, he's a prophet."
17 पदमा फरिसीहरूले फेरि सोधे, तिनीहरूले त्यस अन्धालाई फेरि सोधे, उसले तेरा आँखा खोलिदिएछ, अब उसको विषयमा त के भन्छस्? त्यसले
But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received his sight.
त्यसले जवाफ दियो, उहाँ अगमवक्ता हुनुहुन्छ, दृष्टि पाउनेका आमा बाबुलाई बोलाएर नसोधिन्जेल यहुदीहरूले त्यो अन्धो थियो र देख्ने भयो भनेर विश्वास गरेनन्।
And they asked them, saying, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?"
तब तिनीहरूले उनीहरूलाई सोधे, के यो तिमीहरूको छोरो हो जो अन्धो जन्मेको थियो भनी तिमीहरू भन्छौ त अब कसरी त्यो देख्न सक्ने भयो?
The Jews wouldn't believe unless they could speak to the parents.
यहुदीहरूले आमा बाबुसँग नबोलिकन कुरा नगरिकन विश्वास गर्न सक्दैनथे।
They were filled with unbelief.
तिनीहरू अविश्वासले भरिएका थिए।
One of the biggest spiritual come up against as a visionary is that of unbelief.
अनि दर्शन देख्नेको विरुद्धमा आउन सक्ने एउटा कुरा हो अविश्वास।
And do you know where that spirit of unbelief is usually the most powerful?
के तपाईँ विश्वास गर्नुहुन्छ कहिलेकाहीँ यो अविश्वासको आत्मा एकदमै शक्तिशाली हो भनेर?
In yourself.
यो तपाईमा मात्रै हो।
We just need to start believing ourselves what God says about us in His
हाम्रो
Word.
बारेमा परमेश्वरले आफ्नो इच्छाअनुसार के भन्नुहुन्छ त्यो मात्रै हामीले विश्वास गर्नुपर्छ।
It is so easy to be ruled by what you know about yourself.
तपाईले आफ्नो बारेमा के जान्नु भएको छ भन्ने बारेमा शासित हुनु सजिलो छ।
Your inadequacies or your inferiorities.
तपाईको अपर्याप्तता, तपाईको डरहरू,
But thank God He can see through all of
परमेश्वरलाई
that.
धन्यवाद दिनुहोस्, यी सबै कुराको बावजुदमा पनि तपाईलाई परमेश्वर देख्न सक्नुहुन्छ।
He can see who He has called you to
अनि
be.
तपाई को हुनुहुन्छ हुनलाई उहाँले बोलाउनु भएको त्यो उहाँलाई देख्न सक्नुहुन्छ।
We need to build a godly confidence.
हामीले परमेश्वरमा एउटा भरोसालाई विकास गर्नुपर्दछ।
Hebrews chapter 10 verse 35 says, "Don't throw away your confidence."
हिब्रू 10 को 13 ले भन्छ आफ्नो 35 ले भन्छ आफ्नो विश्वासलाई नफ्याक।
It says confidence has great reward.
अनि विश्वासको ठुलो इनाम छ।
Godly confidence will bear fruit in your life.
परमेश्वरमा भरोसा गर्ने कुरा नै तपाईको जीवनमा फल फलाउने छ।
That the enemy would love to put a seed of unbelief in you.
अविश्वासको बिउ दुष्टले तपाईको जीवनमा राख्न चाहन्छ।
The enemy would love you to look around and see how difficult it is.
अनि दुष्टले तपाईको वरिपरि हेरेर यो कति गाह्रो छ भन्ने गराउन सक्छ।
He would love you to be ruled by the lack of resource in your area.
तपाईको जीवनमा भए